Hey everybody, this is Josh,
And this is Dean.
and we're here with finding an agent. And I want to start off this one by reminding everyone to like and subscribe and leave a comment below, because half the time we do these videos and we forget to remind people that. And if we do remind people, it's usually at the end, and a lot of times people might not be hanging around for the last 10 or 15 seconds of the video. So kind of want to put that plug in there right off the bat this time. So like, subscribe, leave a comment, and maybe we'll get some Q&A or some dialogue going with the viewers going forward. But and then beyond that, we're going to talk about what we've been up to this week. And we also kind of want to talk a little bit about our creative process. But Dean, let's start off with your queries. Where are things standing with that?
All right, got another query letter out this week, another snail mail. This one, I think they just wanted the first 10 pages. So I sent that. And then obviously in the query letter, it's got, somewhat of a synopsis of it, more in terms of like I guess an elevator pitch or whatever. And we've talked about that before. So that was in the query letter, in the letter itself, and then the first 10 pages. And self-addressed stamped envelope as well. So hopefully they will send me some kind of response eventually. We'll see.
And where is this agent located? Are they New York?
New York City.
Man, it seems like they're all in New York. I guess that's kind of the hub for literary agency.
I'm curious to see if maybe over time that's going to change. I guess they could, in theory, keep their office address in New York City, but be, located anywhere at this point in the country. I would assume this is a job you could eminently do, work from home, and, especially since most of it's by email submission now anyway.
Yeah, it really is kind of interesting, because I doubt even before COVID, I doubt there was really a lot of face-to-face interaction that was going on with the agency. I would have assumed that this would have been a lot of stuff, mailing manuscripts and then talking on the phone and doing things like that.
Yeah, and I can't imagine a lot of these agents are rolling in dough. So I'm sure, the idea of living in a 300 square foot apartment in New York City that you're paying, $3,000 a month for, versus moving to West Virginia and, paying $500 a month for rent, I can see why, you might want to make that calculation and just move somewhere else.
Yeah, you would think so. But I don't know. It's interesting. Maybe being in New York adds some air of legitimacy to the agent. I don't know.
Yeah. Clearly there's a reputation there, being an agent from New York, because most of them are claim to be in New York. Whether they actually are or not, I guess, is an open question.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think when I've been looking at agents, I have seen a few that they might be affiliated with an agency or working for an agency, and the agency is based in New York, but I get the feeling the agent themselves might be working remotely from Kentucky or something. Good deal. And you haven't heard anything else on any of the other snail mail queries that you have pending?
No, nothing so far. I'm hopeful that, putting a self-addressed stamped envelope, that I'll at least get a letter from them.
Yeah, hope so too. Well, and on my end, the only thing that I have right now that's out pending is that short story submission, and still haven't heard anything back on that. So hopefully I'll hear something back. Hopefully it'll be a yes, but either way, hopefully I'll get something back soon.
Good deal.
All right. So I think the next thing that we had set to talk about was, I was going to kind of give a little update, a little rundown on the book that I've been reading. That's The Mailman by Bentley Little. To kind of refresh people's memory, I think we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, but here's a picture of the cover of the book that I'm reading on my Kindle. I've mentioned this in the past. I really don't like reading on Kindle. I think there's something in my brain that likes having that tangible book in my hands to tell me where I'm at in the story, and like to see my progress as I'm flipping through the pages. And for example, when you're reading on this particular book, I'm reading and I really don't have a good sense for where I am in the story. And especially as an author, I read things both for entertainment and also with an eye towards writing. And so when I'm looking at this, I like to have an idea of like what's going on, like what are some of the key events in the story and some of the big scenes that are taking place and where are they taking place in the context of the bulk of the novel. And it's a little bit harder to do that when you're on a Kindle, but the book it's interesting. At this point, I'm about halfway through it. I think I've said in the past, I'm a pretty slow reader. I could probably read faster, but I probably wouldn't retain as much. And so that's kind of the trade-off for me. So anyway, I'm about halfway through this book, and it's pretty interesting. I got to say, this book was written in the early 90s. One of the things that I like about it is that it addresses some of the practical things. So this is a horror novel. There's a speculative element to it. One of the things I've said in the past is that for me, I sometimes get a little bit hung up on writing speculative fiction because I still want it to make sense rationally. Like just because you have a speculative element to a story doesn't mean you can abandon all reason. And so with Bentley Little's book that I'm reading, a lot of those questions that don't get addressed in other horror novels do get addressed in this one. For example, there's this mailman that is apparently some malevolent supernatural force who's descended upon the city. Unlike other stories, the main protagonist in this book, he does actually take the steps of trying to contact like the main postal service. Like he calls outside of the city to talk to like the regional postmaster or try to escalate things up the chain to say like, hey, there's something going on with this mail carrier in this town and you guys need to address this in some way. And I know that probably seems like a small common sense thing, but there's a lot of stories in which you'd have something like this unfolding and you would never have a character that would think to escalate this complaint process on up the postal ladder. But at least in this case, Bentley Little's actually got his protagonist thinking a little bit outside the box and doing some things that a real person would do, like trying to escalate this and resolve this matter. And so I thought that was kind of interesting. Overall, the story is very well written. There's some plot elements, or I don't know if you call them plot elements. There doesn't seem to be a lot of subplots in this book. It's kind of like one continuous plot line. And I haven't seen like some big transitory scenes or some big unfolding events that I might normally expect to see in a novel of this length. I looked it up online, and the original hardback version of this book was about 411 pages. And so in a book of that size, you would expect to see like some subplots and some pretty big things unfolding. And I haven't seen a ton of that in his structure, but nevertheless, it's still well written and still flows continuously. So anyway, I've been having a good time reading that book. It's been pretty pleasurable to read another horror author that is kind of a fresh take for me, even though
his first initial is not S and last initial isn't K.
Yeah, exactly.
And you say it was written in the early 90s?
Yeah, I think this was published in 91. From what I've been able to read about him, I think he's fairly culturally, socially minded. And a lot of his stories start with something that he sees in the news. And I guess that kind of is the seed for the idea. And then he extrapolates that into some sort of supernatural horror plot. But yeah, it's kind of interesting because I think he is a little bit more socially minded, and I don't know that his views and his politics are the same as mine. I think he comes at things with a little bit more of a left-leaning slant, but that's okay because he is still exploring things in a critical way, and you can tell there's a lot of thought behind it. And I don't think it's just knee-jerk default, political point of view. But anyway, but I think it's interesting because I think I kind of try to do the same thing. Like a lot of times the stories that I write they're inspired by something that I see going on in the news or something in society, and I want to write about it. And so I come up with a story that in some way reflects on my views of what's going on. And I think he's been doing the same thing for a lot longer than I have. So I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it is. And it's unfortunate that it seems like a lot of the people that are interested in consuming fiction tend to have that, like you said, more left viewpoint. Although it could be a chicken or the egg thing. It may be that people with a more right-wing viewpoint just aren't they aren't seeing anything that they want to read because it's not being given to them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Kind of like we've talked about with fiction being geared towards young males and
Right.
or not being geared towards young males. Yeah, kind of the same type of thing. Well, anyway, that's about all I got to say about the mailman right now. So I'll update on that as I make more progress on it. But I think that kind of leads us to something else we were wanting to talk about. Dean and I have been, last week we touched on COVID a little bit, and it was more in the context of how it affects our daily lives practicing law and stuff. But then Dean kind of mentioned something that was interesting, and we wanted to have a little bit of a discussion about that. And that's how COVID has affected the creative process for writing. Dean, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I'm speaking from personal experience. So I like to dance. We've talked about that. And so starting in March of 2020, there were the shutdown orders, and basically all the bars and everything shut down, and all this dance studios and everything shut down. So there was no partner dancing, and partner dancing during a pandemic probably wouldn't be a great idea because you're, pretty face to face with another person. So I basically spent a year and a quarter, I'd say, not dancing at all after having done that on a regular basis for about the past 5 to 7 years, at least on once a week. And so it was a pretty big change in my life. And then just in general, I had very little interaction with other people other than for work and, maybe, over Zoom and the internet and things like that. But there was a lot less face-to-face interaction with people for about a year, almost a year and a half. And I don't think any of us have fully realized how much that has affected all of us psychologically. And I don't know that we'll ever be able to fully quantify that. There's but part of being a human being is, interacting with other human beings in person. I don't think that we are biological, our part of our biological makeup is the need, I think, to interact with other human beings and to have friendships and form relationships. So I was writing my last novel that I'm submitting for now. And so I finished that, I want to say in August of 2020, and that was still during shutdown period. But after that, I didn't really write again for over 6 months. And I went back to dancing in, about a month ago. And once I started doing that, like I said, I hadn't written anything, but a couple of weeks ago, I banged out a short story, and I did it in a day. And it was after I'd gone back to started dancing again and interacting with people again. And I can't say 100% for sure that this is the case, but it seemed to me that there was a correlation between me getting back out in the world and interacting with people and, having a life and my creativity. It seemed like I was able to write that story very easily, whereas I think it would have been much more excruciating, much more difficult to write it when I was being forced to stay at home by the powers that be, and not interact with other people in real time. And so I think there's something to be said there for the creative process and actually getting out in the world and living your life and having a life, as opposed to just, being an automaton on, interacting with people via computer.
Yeah. Well, for me, I think that a lot of inspiration for stories comes from things that you see or observe. And when you don't have that exposure, it kind of, you just don't have as many, or at least for me, I just don't have as many creative sparks, and I'm just sitting at the house staring at four walls. Then, you really don't have either the interaction with other people, or you don't witness the unfolding of events that might spark the idea for your next story. And like, as an example of that, I mentioned that recently went on vacation with my family, and we stayed at this motel kind of out in the middle of nowhere in Montana. And it was a pretty cool little motel, very old school, and had a great stay there. But something happened that was probably totally harmless, but nevertheless, it kind of inspired the idea for a story. And that's just that we all went to sleep. I mean, I could have sworn I'm usually like pretty cautious with this, when I'm traveling with my family, as being the dad and the husband, try to make sure that we're all safe. Well, the next morning when we woke up, I was going to go out to the car for something, and I realized the door wasn't latched to the hotel.
Wow.
And so there was a chain bolt on the door, and the chain bolt was connected. This door, I do not believe, had a deadbolt on it beyond what was on the doorknob itself. But the door, it wasn't locked. Like, it wasn't even shut. It wasn't open now, and we were in Montana and it was fairly cold. So if the door had been open, I would have known. I would have felt it. I was sleeping closest to the door, but the door was like completely pushed to, but not latched. And so when I woke up the next morning, I was like, okay, that's really weird. Like, I really felt like I would have known that before we went to bed, because I'm usually very vigilant about making sure the doors are locked and everything before my family goes to sleep at night. And of course, my mind immediately started wondering about, like,
What's the
okay,
background on that?
how'd that door get unlocked? Um, and so then, like, 100 different little story ideas start popping into my head just based on that one little event. And that's something that never happened while we were stuck in the house during COVID. So yeah, I think it definitely probably cut down on story ideas for me during that time.
Yeah, and human beings have a subconscious that we're not always fully aware of, and that subconscious has to get material. And I think as you're going about in your day-to-day life observing things, you may only observe something kind of out of the corner of your eye, or just you're focused on something else and you're not able to fully assess what you just kind of like vaguely may notice. And I think a lot of that material ends up in your subconscious, and it's going to provide you with inspiration, for lack of a better word, that you can turn into stories.
Yeah. I agree with you. And I don't have a huge issue with solitude, but it's kind of the way in which this was done. And this is part of, I guess, society now, how we live. Not only were we kind of forced into solitude with COVID, but we were also like quarantined basically into our homes for a large period of time. So not only was it no interaction with other people, but it was very limited interaction even with your environment. And, as a storyteller, you can have different plots, and there's talk about how there's only like a handful of basic plot ideas. There's man versus man, man versus himself, man versus nature, things of that nature. And those are fairly limited. Um, Not only is there man versus man as the origin for a plot idea, but there's man versus nature. But when you're quarantined into your house, you don't even have that interaction with the environment that can help create that spark. And so where I'm kind of going with this is that, like, one of the shows that I really enjoy watching a lot is the survival show Alone. And I don't know if you've ever watched that, but it's
Is
a
that a
show.
reality show, or is that okay?
Yeah, it's a reality survival show where they'll take like 10 people and they drop them in the middle of nowhere completely by themselves. And they'll have a list of like 10 survivalist items that they can take with them. And then it's just how long can they survive in the wilderness by themselves. And it's pretty interesting because, there it's basically man versus the environment. And so they have issues combating, whether it's the climate or wild animals or against themselves. A lot of them have a hard time coping with not having other people to interact with and being alone, trying to find food. But there's a lot of conflict that comes up and a lot of obstacles that they have to overcome, even though they don't have interaction with other people. But we didn't even have that with COVID because people weren't able to leave the house. So yeah, the dampening effect on creativity I don't think that can be exaggerated. Like, I think it was huge. And I don't know. I mean, I guess a lot of productions, even movie productions, were probably cut back and things of
Yeah.
that nature because people couldn't interact and stuff. But yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say, like the long-term effects. You mentioned psychologically. I think we're going to see how that plays out over time. And of course, we've seen a lot of that. I mean, with increased suicide rates, there's been talk about people that weren't able to go to the doctor or didn't go to the doctor because they were discouraged from leaving their homes. So, how many cancers went
Yeah.
undiagnosed?
Yeah.
How many terminal illnesses, things of that nature. You know, the long-term fallout from this, yeah, I don't think it'll be years before we really know it. But yeah, just from a very personal perspective, I think the creativity aspect, or the dampening of the creativity, I think that's one of the things that really sucks the worst for me.
Yeah, I agree.
So um, I don't mind saying, like during COVID, my creativity, my production dropped significantly. Like I had a difficult time, not only a difficult time, and this is probably going to what you were talking about psychologically, but a difficult time getting motivated to do writing, and then a difficult time just finding that creative spark as well. My productivity during that year of COVID shutdown was pretty low, pretty crappy. And yeah, that's really not good when you're a writer and you got to find that way to keep going. And we've talked about like the inertia of writing. And when you're not writing, it tends to snowball. And when you're on a good roll, it tends to snowball too. But that year of COVID, it was definitely not very productive for me anyway.
Yeah, for me, it was just, I had a pre-existing novel I was working on, so I was able to kind of ride that wave. But after I finished that, I just did not have much motivation. I'm hopeful that things will get back to normal now, and maybe COVID will eventually be enough in the rearview mirror that you and I and other people can use it as the basis for inspiration for things. We'll see, how that goes in terms of how that kind of gets woven into our cultural framework. I mean, I think 9/11 had an impact on culture and art and things like that. I mean, a lot of the major dramatic TV shows I remember did 9/11 type references. Some shows didn't because it just wouldn't fit with the tone. Like Friends never referenced 9/11, obviously, because how can you make that funny? But I remember a lot of the more dramatic shows, the cop shows and the firefighter shows for certain. Almost all of them referenced 9/11 and kind of what had happened in 9/11, especially with cops and firefighters in New York. Um, so I would assume that will pop up in the TV shows and or now I guess it would be on Netflix or whatever as time goes by.
Yeah, that brings up something that's really interesting about COVID, though. So very early on in the COVID process, I wrote that story, that novella, "Chasing the Wicked Flu," and it was set in the Old West, and it was loosely inspired by COVID, and kind of had like a family that had been affected by this wicked flu, chasing down the the person responsible for spreading this pestilence. And man, like that book kind of met some resistance. Like, first of all, I had an issue because the cover art for it had guns on it, and
Right, I remember
so
that.
I wasn't even able to advertise it, because it displayed a gun, which I thought was pretty ridiculous, being a Western story. But anyway, not up to me, but that's the way that was. The other thing is, people freaked out about COVID. Like, it was bizarre. You couldn't write a story about COVID at the time because I don't know if they were afraid of people profiting off of the pandemic, or if it was a concern about misinformation about COVID safety. I'm not sure exactly what their official reasoning for it was, but like I could not advertise the story as having any connection whatsoever to do with COVID. it was weird. It was like I mean, for all of the talk that we have about freedom of speech and creativity and the arts and all of those things that, we supposedly have in the United States, man, they were clamping down hard on people having any creative storytelling that incorporated the pandemic in any way.
Yeah, and I'm a free market guy, and I think that companies, if they want to make business decisions about what they think is in the best interest of their business, whatever. But I think it's interesting that all of these tech companies basically have spent the last 20 years telling us, oh, you're going to come to our platform and be able to speak your mind, and that's going to be great because it's going to democratize the whole process, and everybody's going to be able to say what they say their piece. So come to our platform and get on it. And as soon as people came to their platform and got on them and started saying their piece, they said, oh, no, you can't, we got to start shunting these people off of the platform because we don't want them expressing these views.
Yeah, well, you see a lot of that. There's one side in particular that loves to talk about free speech and people being able to speak their mind and have their own point of view and stuff. But the minute they don't like what you're saying, that all goes out the window. And it's kind of like, there's certain media company that I won't say their name, but they're all about progressive values and stuff. But then when one of their female stars came out as conservative and was posting on social media about her conservative values, she got fired. And so it's like, yeah, they support strong independent women as long as they approve of what they're saying.
Yeah, well, and then that's from the Marxist playbook, which is, we want free speech for advancing our agenda, but they don't really want free speech. They only want it as long as it advances their agenda.
Yeah. And I've always thought it was kind of interesting that they always talk about the right being oppressive and fascist, and they throw out those type of words and what have you. But if the right was really as oppressive and fascist and restrictive as they claim, then these platforms would have never evolved. And now the left has massive social media platforms with which they can silence some people and promote those who further their agenda. And that's all because the right never actually silenced them in the way that they silenced the right. And I don't know, it's interesting that really doesn't get talked about or mentioned very often, but kind of a tangent there. But going back to what you were saying about seeing COVID pop up in fiction going forward, the way that we saw fictional versions of 9/11 and stuff like that, I think we probably will see that now that we're kind of starting to come out of the woods a little bit on this. Just thought it was interesting that while it was going on, companies like Amazon or Facebook really were not letting that happen.
And there was definitely a lot of fear there.
Yeah, I don't think the effects of COVID on creativity can be minimized. I think it's going to really impact people, and hopefully, like you said, there'll be like a flourishment of fiction that's inspired by it and that comes out of it. But at least for the last year, it sucked pretty hard.
Yeah, it sure did.
Hopefully, come next week, maybe fingers crossed, we'll have either Dean will have some feedback on his queries, or maybe I'll get a response on my pending submission and can move forward with my short story collection. But either way, we'll have some good stuff to share with you next week. And in the meantime, hopefully everyone can like and subscribe and maybe leave us a comment down below. And anyway, have a good week.
Take care, everybody.
Sorry, I got to start over.
I don't know why that's backwards. It's really weird.
Shit. All right.
We'll get better at this as we go, I guess. And
what's going into the sausage here?
There's definitely some reflection off my head. Yeah, I may end up in federal prison.